Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first meeting of the Cider Evaluation course. This time, we will start with an introduction to cider evaluation. To those of you who do not know me, my name is Omer Basha. I am a Grandmaster Beer Judge, and at the time of recording this, I am the Europe, Middle East, and Africa Regional Representative in the BJCP. Back in 2016, I started organizing BJCP exams in Israel. Ever since then, I've proctored many exams in the region, and I am an active exam grader in the BJCP. To this date, I gave 3 beer courses, 3 mead courses, and this is the 3rd time I am giving a cider course. This course is designed to be a wholesome course about cider evaluation. My hope is that first, this course will open your mind to everything related to cider, different techniques and processes in cider making, cider styles, and eventually how to perform a complete evaluation of the ciders you make and ciders that others made. Just wanted to remind you that if you liked the video, please hit that like button. And if you have any questions, please comment on the video and I will answer. If, for some reason, you still haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon to get notified when my next videos come out. In addition, if you haven't followed me on my social media, you can see them changing on the screen right now or find them in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get to our presentation of the day with an introduction to cider evaluation. This is the layout of today's presentation. We will begin with the course schedule and bibliography, then move on to talk a bit about the purpose of the BJCP and its structure, go over the cider style guidelines and the anatomy of a style, and talk about the cider evaluation scoresheet and the evaluation process. This is the course schedule. This is the first talk of the course. In the next meeting, we will talk about the cider making process, and in the 3rd meeting, we will discuss optional and specialty processes in cider making. In the 4th meeting, we will talk about cider evaluation and how to write a complete cider evaluation. And in the 5th and last meeting, we will talk about flavors and off-flavors in cider and how we can control them. This is the course bibliography. The course will be based on the Cider Style Guidelines, the Cider Exam Study Guide, and the BJCP Ingredients Guide. In the Exam Study Guide, you can find all the materials you need to know to pass the entrance exam. It is undoubtedly one of the most updated documents about cider making today. To those of you who want to expand their studies, the BJCP recommends many books about cider, but I recommend these 2. The New Cider Maker Handbook by Claude Julicoeur and Craft Cider Making by Andrew Lee. Now, after talking about the course, let's move on to talk about the BJCP. The BJCP was founded as a collaboration by the American Homebrewers Association, the AHA, and the Beer and Wine Trade Association in 1985, but was separated from these organizations, and now it works as an independent organization. The BJCP goal is to encourage knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of the world's diverse beers, meads, and ciders, to promote, recognize, and advance beer, mead, and cider tasting, evaluation, and communication skills, and lastly, to develop standardized tools, methods, and processes for structured evaluation, ranking, and feedback of beer, mead, and cider. The BJCP has 3 tracks of exams. The first is for beer and has 3 exam types. The first is an online entrance exam that consists of 180 questions and must be completed in 60 minutes. It is considered a very hard exam and not many people pass it. The second exam is the beer tasting exam, which consists of evaluation and feedback for 6 beers in 90 minutes. And the third exam is a written proficiency exam that consists of true or false questions and writing 5 college-level essays. This exam is needed to advance through the ranks beyond certified. The second exam track is for mead. It consists of two types of exam: an online entrance exam that consists of 200 questions in 60 minutes, and a mead tasting exam which consists of evaluation of 6 meads in 90 minutes. The third exam track is for cider. It consists of two types of exams as well: an online entrance exam that consists of 100 questions in 30 minutes, and a cider tasting exam which consists of evaluation and feedback for 6 ciders in 90 minutes. For each tasting exam, 2 high-ranking judges are needed to proctor the exam. These should be national and above judges for beer, or for mead and cider, judges who scored above 80 in the mead and cider exams, respectively, or be a master beer judge. In this course, we will focus on the cider track. The cider program entrance exam is made of 100 questions in 30 minutes. The questions can be true or false, multiple choice, or multiple choice multiple selection in various topics in cider evaluation. The topics will include judging procedures and ethics, ingredients, styles, cider making, troubleshooting, and more. After you have completed and passed the exam, you have to send the exam admin the certificate number that is written in the upper right of the certificate. The exam admin will have to submit this number to the BJCP before the tasting exam. In the cider tasting exam, you will evaluate 6 ciders in 90 minutes. That's 15 minutes for each cider. I recommend to start practicing cider evaluation in 15 minutes. We're not used to writing by hand these days, and it can take some practice to be able to write so much. The exam is closed book, and no auxiliary materials are allowed. The exam is graded by 5 competencies: scoring accuracy, perceptive ability, descriptive ability, feedback, and completeness. Notice the first 2 competencies are dependent on other people in the exam, while the descriptive ability, feedback, and completeness are only dependent on you. So, you want to go over these first to get a better score. Now, let's talk about the ranks people always talk about in the BJCP. These are more relevant to beer than to mead and cider, but after you've passed the online entrance exam, you're considered a provisional judge. After the tasting exam, and until you receive your score, you are considered a rank pending judge. You have to take the tasting exam within 1 year of completing the entrance exam, or you will have to take the entrance exam again. If you received less than 60 points in the tasting exam, you're considered an apprentice judge. If you receive more than 60, you're a recognized judge. And if you have more than 70 points in the tasting exam and 5 experience points from judging competitions, you become a certified judge. After you judge or help in competitions, you receive experience points. These can be judging points or staff points. Every rank requires a number of experience points you must have to advance. For example, judging a competition gets you half a point per session. However, if you are a steward in the competition, you will get half a point for each day. To advance to national and master ranks, you need to take the third exam. If you have a composite score between the tasting exam and written proficiency exam of over 80, and you have 20 experience points, you will advance to national judge. If you have a composite score of 90 and above, and 40 experience points, you will get the rank of master. To this day, there are only 164 people that received the master rank. Lastly, if you are a master and you have over 100 experience points and 240 GMSR points, you can get the Grand Master rank. Only national and above judges can administer or grade exams. In mead and cider, you only have to pass the tasting exam with a score of 60 to receive the certification of mead or cider judge. The cider judge rank, or endorsement is awarded to every member who passed the cider tasting exam with a score of 60 and above. If you are already a beer judge, this will be an endorsement that says you are certified in cider as well as in beer. To members who are only cider judges, meaning they did not take the beer tasting exam, this is their rank. Both mead and cider judges are full members of the organization. At this time, there is no rank above a cider judge, but there might be in the future. Experience points are accumulated as for beer judges, but there really is nothing to do with them because there is no promotion or something. To summarize, we talked about the BJCP goals, the exam structure, and the rank structure. Now, we will move on to talk about the cider style guidelines. The Style Guidelines is a book containing definitions for cider styles. The most recent version is from 2015. This guide was well adopted by both home and commercial cider makers. Today, this is the most common cider style guidelines in the world, but it still misses many cider styles that are common in the world. Things like Busk and austere ciders, fire ciders, and many more are still missing. Hopefully, it will get better in the next version. The guide uses categories and styles to define ciders and perries. A style defines the primary characteristics of a specific type of cider or perry. However, categories are totally arbitrary. Usually, they will have styles with similar characteristics, but sometimes there's really no connection between the styles. Their purpose is to gather styles for convenience. In addition, the order in the style guidelines should not be taken as a recommended drinking order. Here are a few points on using the style guidelines. These are guidelines and not specifications. Their goal is not to nitpick and say, oh, this English cider has more smoky aroma than another cider, and that's why it's more the style. A cider should be evaluated on conforming to the guidelines, but if there's a discussion if one cider is better or worse than another cider, then the cider that presents a better technique and a lack of off flavors should win. The style guidelines were created for homebrew competitions. There are many commercial ciders who claim to be in a certain style and expand it. And so, you can't say that they are not the style. They are. But these guidelines weren't created for them. Many organizations use these guidelines. The BJCP gives any person or organization the option to use the style guidelines for free. But always remember that every use not for the original intent has to be done knowingly that this was not the original intent. Styles change over time. If the name of the style did not change, it doesn't mean that the style hasn't changed. Styles change due to new techniques in cider making, ingredients availability, and trend in public tastes. Remember, not every commercial cider or perry fall into a certain style, and the purpose of the guidelines wasn't to classify every cider in existence. So, if you have a cider that doesn't fit any style in the guidelines, it is an option that it doesn't have a style in these guidelines. Commercial examples change over time and between countries. So, sometimes a commercial example listed here will not always fit the style. Most styles are fairly broad. There are people who believe that these styles limit the creativity of a cider maker, but the opposite is true. Most styles are fairly broad and allow for flexibility. Notice that you will usually encounter statements like medium-low to medium-high carbonation. In most cases, there is room for the cider maker to experiment with, but boundaries must be placed for styles. It's not possible that every style will contain all the cider world. Some separation from other styles is needed. The most important thing to remember is that the guidelines are not the 10 Commandments, and you don't need to fanatically get lost in parsing each word in the guidelines. The guidelines are updated every few years, but new styles can be introduced between updates. The BJCP main purpose is to test judges, and it's not possible if the reference changes all the time. The BJCP adopted an attitude of introducing provisional styles, and in each update, the ones who become popular will get into the guidelines. The BJCP is not the beer, mead, or cider police. If you are drinking a cider that you don't really like, you don't need to run to the brewer and ask why isn't the beer, mead, or cider isn't exactly the same as the guidelines say. Notice that many organizations have adopted the BJCP guidelines and that it has been translated into many languages, or not all copies or formats are precise. So, check if you are using any third-party guidelines that it's accurate. And lastly, the BJCP does not run competitions. All the decisions in a competition are made by the competition organizer. The BJCP has a minimal set of ethical standards for a competition. For example, the judging must be blind and that the judge cannot know who the entry belongs to or can judge their own beer, mead, or cider. After talking about the style guidelines, let's move on to talk about how a cider style is built in the guidelines and the different sections it contains. We'll start with the overall impression section. In the past, this section was a repeat of the aroma, appearance, flavor, and mouthfeel. Now, this section describes the essence of the style, the points that make it different from other styles. You can also think about this section as a short guide. A salesman can tell a customer who does not know anything about cider and describes the cider to someone who is not a cider judge. This part uses many terms that are not from the cider judging world to describe it as simple as possible to people without the details cider judges need. For example, here we can see the overall impression of the first style of cider, New World Cider. A refreshing drink of some substance, not bland or watery. Sweet ciders must not be cloying. Dry ciders must not be too austere. We can see that the definition here is not in judges' terms and does not talk about dealing with aromas and flavors. Now, let's move on to discuss the sections of aroma and flavor, appearance, and mouthfeel. These three parts are the building blocks that define a cider style, and they are the guidelines against which we evaluate a cider entry. These parts were rewritten in 2015 to fit the things a judge perceives instead of ingredients or techniques. Saying that a cider has apples flavor doesn't really define what one should perceive in the style. These guidelines were written in order that a judge who doesn't really know the style or ingredients can evaluate it according to the guidelines. After the parts of appearance, aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel comes the comment section. This part contains some nice trivia about the style that does not influence the evaluation of the style. Not every style has a wide comment section. Some of these are really short. For example, in New World Cider, there's trivia about food pairing. Now comes the part of apple or pear varieties. This part doesn't try to give you all the details to create a recipe, but to describe the common ingredients to a style that help get its key characteristics. Not all ciders are made the same way or from the same ingredients, and that's why they just try to describe what is characteristic and not what is required. All cider styles have entry instructions. These are things judges need in order to evaluate the cider. Entrants who submit cider entries have to supply this information, and if they do not, we will use defaults. Competition organizers always have to make sure that this information is available to the judges. And now for the commercial examples section. This part lists commercial examples that well represents the style. It doesn't mean that every cider from this list will get a perfect score and that ciders that are not listed here will get a lesser score. In addition, this part sometimes changes because commercial examples change. You should not take these examples as a benchmark for the style. One cider can rarely showcase the entire range of the style. You should always judge a style by what's listed in the aroma, flavor, appearance, and mouthfeel parts, and not limit yourself to one example. As I said in the entry instructions part, to evaluate a cider, there are 4 must-have parameters to know. The first is sweetness. A cider can be dry, semi-dry, medium, semi-sweet, and sweet. The second is carbonation. A cider can be still, pétillant, or sparkling. The third is optional. The entrant can specify the apple varieties used to make the cider. The fourth is also optional, but it is required in specific styles and is special ingredients like other fruits, spices, malts, and more. The Cider Style Guidelines uses a standard cider style, and all the rest of the styles expand or change it. In the aroma and flavor of a standard cider, there is no requirement to have strong fruity aroma or flavors. The acidity can be high as long as it brings a clean feeling without acidification. Phenols should not be present, and so are chemical aromas and flavors. Tannin levels vary greatly between ciders and affect both bitterness and astringency. But we do need to expand about sweetness. Cider sweetness can be between dry to dessert wine. The entrant must always specify what is the sweetness level they aimed for. The order of evaluation should be from dry to sweet. Judges should be aware that high sweetness can mask faults. Here we can see the final gravities of each of the sweetness levels. If the cider is dry, it means that it has a final gravity of less than 1.002. If it's semi-sweet, it means that it has a final gravity between 1.002 to 1.004. A medium cider has a final gravity between 1.004 and 1.009. Semi-sweet cider has a final gravity between 1.009 to 1.019, and a sweet cider will have a final gravity greater than 1.019. Now, let's move on to the appearance of a standard cider. The clarity has to be good to brilliant, but a lack of clarity is not a fault. Yet, if the cider has floating particles, it is a fault. The color can vary widely depending on the type of apples, ingredients, and making processes. The carbonation can be still to sparkling, like in champagne wine. When there is a high level of carbonation, a foam head can form for a short while. In the mouthfeel part of a standard cider, we expect similar sensations like in low ABV wine. The body can vary greatly, but most cider will have thin to medium body. Low astringency is optional and can add to the balance and structure of the cider. Tannins should not pass the levels in a low tannin red wine like a Burgundian Pinot Noir. The carbonation in a still cider can have some bubbles and does not have to be perfectly still. A pétillant cider should have recognizable bubbles, and in a cider with high carbonation can have mouth-filling carbonation all the way to champagne-like carbonation. The standard cider also has standard ingredients. In most cases, cider is made from apples, water, and yeast. Additives and adjuncts are not permitted unless the style calls for their use. Enzymes, acids, chemicals, and malolactic clusters are permitted if they are not detectable in the cider. The cider maker can control the sweetness by stopping the fermentation or by back sweetening. Wood must be declared except in the C2F style. Carbonation can be natural or forced carbonation. To submit a cider to a competition, the entrant has to specify the sweetness and carbonation levels. The sweetness level can be dry, semi-dry, medium, semi-sweet, or sweet. The carbonation level can be still, pétillant, or sparkling. In addition, the entrant can specify the apple varieties with their source and season, but this is optional. Certain styles might require more data. For example, in a fruit cider, the entrant must specify the types of fruits that were used. If no carbonation was supplied, the cider should be judged as medium sweetness and pétillant carbonation. After talking about the standard cider style, let's move on to discuss the different cider styles currently in the guidelines. In the standard cider category, we have 5 styles. New World cider is the cider we know from regular apples with some crab apples for tannins. Usually, will not have any special ingredients or processes. English cider is a cider that is made of high tannin and acidity apples that was aged in oak barrels. The barrels are usually used, so there's no flavor addition from the wood, but there will usually be malolactic fermentation, aroma, and flavors. French cider is a cider that is made using several special techniques, such as Kieve, and we will talk about it in future meetings. New World Perry is the same as New World cider, only made from pears. And lastly, traditional perry is a perry that is made from perry pears and not from dessert pears. The second category holds all of the specialty ciders. New England cider is a cider that is made from apple varieties that grow in the New England region of the U.S., with brown sugar additions to get a higher alcohol level. Cider with other fruit is a cider that is made from apple juice along with other fruit or juices not from apples. This is also the style to submit cider and perry blends. Applevine is a cider style with large additions of white sugar to get more alcohol. Ice cider is a cider that went through cold distillation like an ice bock. Cider with herbs or spices is a cider made with any herb or spice. And lastly, specialty cider or perry are all ciders and perries that did not fit into any other style. We talked about how a style is built, the standard cider style and the current styles. Now, let's move on to talk about the cider score sheet of the BJCP. This is the BJCP cider score sheet. As you can see, it is divided into several sections. In the top part, there is a place to write the details of the judge, and on the other side, you have a place to note the entry number, style, special ingredients, entry data, and more. On the left side of the score sheet, there is a list of descriptors. The judges need to mark each one that was detected in the cider. On the right part, there is a place to write comments about the appearance, aroma, flavor and mouthfeel, and overall impression. The BJCP scoring system has 50 points for each cider, 10 points for aroma, 6 points for appearance, 24 points for flavor, and 10 points for overall impression. The bottom part has a scoring guide and 3 axes for stylistic accuracy, technical merit, and intangibles. After we got to know the cider score sheet, I wish to discuss a few things about cider evaluation. The overall impression should conform to the descriptions in the bottom of the page. In general, the best ciders in the competition should be assigned a score of over 80. If a cider gets a perfect score of 50, it should be perfect, have absolutely no flaws, exemplify the style well, or better than the commercial examples, be perfectly fresh and well handled and presented. Since most entrants do not control the handling and presentation, it is extremely hard to get a perfect score. When providing feedback for very good ciders, it is important to identify ways in which the cider can be improved and mention these characteristics on the score sheet. Any serious flaw or missing aspect of the cider style, such as lack of alcohol character in apple wine, should result at a maximum score around 30. A cider that is strongly contaminated or that contains a flaw so severe that it makes the cider undrinkable can be assigned a score of 13. A score of 13 makes the point that the cider is essentially undrinkable. Lower scores can be taken spiteful. However, these are just guidelines, and some flaws require a score lower than 13. As we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, evaluation should have a structure. In the BJCP beer and mead score sheets, the structure is listed in the little prompts beneath the titles of the different sections. However, in the cider score sheet, it is not. That's why I created this slide that contains what I believe is a complete cider evaluation. So, memorize the things in this slide to know what you need to write about in every section. Now, after we discussed the cider score sheet, let's move on to talk about the cider evaluation process. What is a formal cider evaluation and what is it needed for? A cider evaluation should provide the cider maker 3 things. The first is feedback on how much the cider represents the style it was entered as. This feedback is useful to fine-tune recipes. The second is troubleshooting advice. These diagnostics are useful when the entrant can't identify the origin of off flavors. A knowledgeable cider judge can give the entrant suggestions to change ingredients, processes, and equipment to eliminate off flavors. For example, if a judge identifies fusel alcohols in the cider and suggests changing the process of nutrient additions, or if the judge identifies diacetyl and suggests changing the fermentation schedule to add a diacetyl rest. The feedback is very useful for the cider maker who wants to improve their process. And, in the end, a formal cider evaluation gives a way to determine which are the better ciders in a cider competition. Now, let's move on to talk about how does a cider judge evaluates a cider. We will discuss 3 things: decision strategies, scoring guidance, and procedure. We'll start by talking about decision strategies. There are 2 main strategies when evaluating cider. The top-down approach. The judge decides what is the overall impression and assigns a total score, and then breaks it down to the different subsections. The problem with this approach is that it is hard to ensure that the points for each category will agree with the comments in the category. The second approach is the bottom-up approach. The judge decides what are the scores for each subsection by deducting points for any missing descriptor or off-flavor, and then sums them up to get the total score. The problem with this method is that it's easy to overscore entries. To sum up, judges who use top-down will miss the trees for the forest, and judges who use bottom-up will miss the forest for the trees. Most judges use a combined approach, which will be discussed soon. After talking about decision strategies, let's move on to talk about the evaluation process. The BJCP recommends evaluating cider in the following way. Start with preparing the score sheet. Write the entry number, style category, and subcategory, both letter, number, and style name, your name, and all the rest of the details on the score sheet. Afterwards, if you receive a bottle, you should visually inspect the bottle. You should check for fill level, clarity, sediment, and things that can indicate a problem like a ring of gunk in the neck of the bottle, floating flakes in the cider, rusted cap, etc. But beware not to judge the cider too early by the bottle. Now, pour the cider into a clean glass, making an effort to create a foam head if there is carbonation. Ciders with high carbonation will be poured close to the glass, while ciders with low carbonation will be poured from up to 15 centimeters from the glass. If the cider is still, there is no need to stir up a foam head. Now, we will smell the cider as soon as it is poured. Stir the cider in the glass and bring it to your nose and breathe in the aromas a few times. If the cider is too cold, warm the cider by using your hands and stirring it, or put your hand above the cup to allow the volatile aromas to accumulate to a high enough degree to identify them. Write all of the aroma impressions you can feel, making sure not to forget anything you should evaluate from the evaluation structure and not to miss any off-flavor. But don't give a score to the aroma section just yet. Now, move on to visually inspect the cider. Let your nose rest and comment about the appearance. Tilt the glass and inspect it through a backlight. For darker ciders, it might be necessary to use a flashlight to inspect the cider for clarity. Comment on the cider color, clarity, and foam head. Score the appearance and give each one of the characteristics 2 points. Now, smell the cider again. Stir the glass again, bring it to your nose, and smell it a few times. Notice how the aroma changes when the cider warms up and volatile aromas evaporate. If you find changes from the first evaluation, write them in the score sheet. Also, notice off aromas that are left until now. Next, we will move on to taste the cider. Take a 30 milliliter sip into your mouth and coat all of your mouth with the cider, the lips, the gums, teeth, palate, tongue, and everything. Swallow the cider and exhale through your nose. Aromatic compounds evaporate inside the mouth due to heat, and we want to move them to the nose. Write your impressions on the initial flavors, the apples, alcohol, and sweetness, the middle flavors, more apple flavors, fruitiness, diacetyl, and acidity, and the final flavors, the tannins, phenols, oxidation, and astringency. Don't score the flavor section just yet. Take another sip and write down how the mouthfeel fits the style. The mouthfeel includes the body, carbonation level, alcoholic warmth, creaminess, and astringency. Next, evaluate the overall impression. Relax, take a deep breath, smell and taste the cider again, and stop to consider where does the cider fit in the total score and where do similar ciders rank in the total score in the flight. If you use the method of top-down decision, give a total score and then break it down to each category. If you use bottom-up, score each category and stop to consider if the cider confirms with the total score. Eventually, write feedback about how to improve the cider. Next, remember to mark the descriptors on the left side of the evaluation form that were perceived in your comments. And lastly, check the Scoresheet for completeness. Add your score for each section and make sure that the numbers add up to the total score. When all the judges finish, talk about how much the cider fits the style and reach a consensus. In most competitions, you'll be asked to change the scores so that they will be within a 7-point range between the lowest to the highest score. And of course, don't forget to mark the axis for stylistic accuracy, technical merit, and intangible. After talking about the cider evaluation procedure, let's move on to a few comments about assessing cider aroma. When a judge smells a cider, they literally breathe tiny particles of the cider. The sense of smell works by identifying molecules that transfer into the air through diffusion. These molecules enter the nasal cavity where receptors called olfactory cells identify and translate the chemical information into information the brain can understand. There are a few things that can influence a judge's ability to evaluate cider aroma. The first thing is that not all people are born equal. There are different densities of receptors in different people. So, some judges may simply be more sensitive to odors than other judges. These people are called supertasters. In addition, the receptor cells can be damaged by exposure to strong substances such as ammonia, nasal drugs, and other strong and pungent aromas. The receptors can take up to 2 weeks to heal. Also, changes in the thickness of the mucus that lines the nasal cavity can influence a judge's ability to detect aromas. So, a judge must be aware to their health status and their ability to identify odors. One of the problems of our olfactory cells is that they become desensitized to odors after a long or repeated exposure to substances. Be sure to be aware of that and occasionally smell your shirt sleeve. It will have a different aroma to the cider that should be sufficient to reset your olfactory cells. Lastly, regardless of the judge's ability to detect aromas, all of this doesn't really help unless the judge can communicate the sensations into words. A cider judge should work to build a vocabulary to describe the aromas they perceive. And now, for a few comments about the sense of taste. The sense of taste works similarly to the sense of smell. Taste is the sense through which the chemical information of solids is identified and transferred to the brain. The molecules are identified by 5 types of flavor receptors that are located on the tongue and the palate. Some of the tongue areas are more sensitive to different flavors, but all of them can sense all of the flavors. The known tongue map was proven to be false, and all the parts of the tongue can sense everything. The basic 5 tastes are sweetness, acidity, saltiness, bitterness, and umami. Since all of these tastes can be in a cider, it is very important that the judges coat all of their palate with the cider when they evaluate one, and also swallow the cider. As in olfactory cells, taste receptors can be damaged by exposure to spicy food, smoking, hot foods, etc. Judges need to be aware of their own sensitivities and take into account sources of damage when evaluating a cider. In addition, taste buds can be desensitized to some flavors by traces of other substances in the mouth, so it is best that judges rinse their mouth with water between ciders and clean their palates using bread between entries. Same as in aroma, cider judges should work to build a flavor vocabulary to communicate about cider. The last thing I want to talk about in this presentation are some things to keep in mind when writing a cider evaluation. First, the comments should be as positive as possible. Always note the good aspects of the cider before the negative parts. Not only that it helps make negative comments easier to take for the cider maker, it also gives your evaluation more credibility. Be polite with everything you write about ciders. Sarcastic and deprecating comments should never be written on a scoresheet. Be descriptive and never use ambiguous terms such as nice. Instead, use words to describe the aroma, appearance, and flavor of the cider. Be diagnostic and provide the cider maker with possible causes for undesirable characteristics and offer advice on how to change the recipe or processes to eliminate these characteristics. Lastly, be humble. Do not speculate anything you are not sure about the cider, like which apple varieties were used, and apologize if you can't identify or describe unwanted cider characteristics. This is where we finish the first presentation of the cider course about an introduction to cider evaluation. I hope that the talk was informative and interesting and that my accent was not too distractive. I just want to remind you that if you like the video, please hit that like button to know when the next videos come out. If you have questions, please write them in the comment section and I will answer them. In addition, you can see my social media handles change on the screen or find them in the description of the video, and you are welcome to follow me to know when my next projects come out. Thank you for listening. I was Omer Basha, and see you in the next meeting where we will discuss the cider making process.